Welcome everyone to the first Innovation Circle episode in 2025. Sorry, I'm still in the last year. It's a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and I think also a few new faces online. And we're delighted also to be joined by our colleagues here in person. I see some people are still joining us. So today we have a very interesting topic lined up, namely sustainable transformations in the energy sector. So the title, What is Holding Us Back? And we're very eager to look into this topic because, I mean, we see a lot of technological advancements, but at the same time, we still encounter quite a few systemic behavioral barriers when it comes to sustainable transformations in the energy sector. So I won't speak too much on it because we have many experts here to talk about it, but just to mention that this latches on very well into a previous discussion we had on energy in our Innovation Circle series, but also to the discussion that we had at the Action Forum in Brussels last year, which many of you joined, including today's moderator, Stefan Büttner, who is not only an ETIN member, but also Director of Global Strategy and Impact at the Institute for Energy Efficiency, also the Chair of the UNECE Task Force for Industrial Energy Efficiency, and the co-lead for Circular Economy and Climate Neutral Manufacturing at Fraunhofer. So Stefan, you have many titles, and I think it's nice to pick and choose which ones you use. And we're also joined here today by Dario, our Director of Energy here at UNECE. So thank you so much, Dario, for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and before we hand over to Stefan, Anders, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, I'll try to keep them brief and try to say a few things from sort of a personal perspective, because this is a topic I'm very interested in. And the trigger was actually two things. One was a great discussion I had with Dario on how we could cooperate, and we came up with several ideas. And I was fascinated in particular by one thing he said. Why have we seen so little innovation around ways to harness energy that could actually be better and replace fossil fuels? And the other was a seminar that we had on AI and climate, which was very fascinating. But it was also fascinating because of the things that didn't come up. One of those was, can we think more broadly? We talked about electric vehicles, but what about autonomous vehicles that could also manage supply and demand at scale, be much more energy efficient? And if they can replace car ownership altogether, it would be both a benefit for consumers and a benefit, of course, for the environment. And other issues like that. So these broader issues didn't come over. So I wanted to tap into the energy from Dario here, who's the Director of Sustainable Energy Division, but also comes from the private sector. And he's also aware of what is needed also for sustainability in the commercial sense, and eventually to find alternatives that are so good and better than fossil fuels that we can expect developing and emerging economies to switch at scale as well, which is perhaps the most important barrier that we are facing on current trends. I'm also fascinated because I'm a student of history, both personally, and I also did some work in my position under ETIN. And I really looked into how has innovation worked in the past. And I found so many instances of challenges that, at least at the time when we were much poorer, should have been equal in magnitude to what we are facing now, and where people were able to solve it. You can talk about the Dutch that managed to basically wall off their entire country by looking at beavers and the dirt poor Middle Ages. You can talk about the switch to fossil fuels itself, which you can argue was driven by England basically running out of forests. You could talk about when we ran out of naturally mineable fertilizers, and we thought that everyone was going to starve. And just a decade later, we had synthetic fertilizers. So why is the challenge that we're facing now, even though it's more pervasive, so difficult, and why are we seeing so little innovation? And I think it would be great to have a discussion about that and also look a little bit more broadly. What might take a little bit more time, but be much more effective, and above all, make fossil fuels basically obsolete just by commercial incentives because they're better. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, and I really look forward to the discussion and especially also the questions that you have. And our moderator also is Stefan Büttner, who to my mind also comes from another perspective than Dario, and I'm also really looking forward to the dynamism that can come out of this discussion. So many thanks to everyone for joining, and I think Stefan as moderator, over to you first of all.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's great to see you all from wherever you are joining. And I'm really glad that we are here today, you, Dario, and all the others, to discuss quite an important topic. And that is what actually does hold us back from the future. Because we do have so many ingredients already sitting there, but essentially our progress is way too slow. And what future are we aiming at? Well, looking at all those different crises that we have around, all those challenges to the way we operate, to the economies, the businesses, the people, the changing climate, the way that ahead of us that we should strive towards is how do we get an innovative transformation towards an economic and just and future-proof and net zero compatible and resilient economy or business or system. So what holds us back from getting there? And that, Dario, I think is the first element I'm going to quiz you on. What are your thoughts? What holds us back in a nutshell?
Thanks, Stefan, and thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. I think there are a number of different things that are peculiar to energy. The first one is obviously energy is very pervasive. I mean, if you look at the world GDP, world population, and wealth, and you plot it against the energy use, they are very much on a one-to-one direct relationship. And the reason why we are where we are is thanks to the progressive discovery of more energy intensive sources, which permitted where we are today with our material wealth and all of it. So it's very pervasive. It's across all the economy, everything we live. Energy you can qualify as blood. So if you want to change the blood, then you need to have a very specific system, because you're taking out blood from a body, and then you need to try to change it with something else while the body is still alive. You cannot take the blood away and then hope for the body to survive. That's one point. The second point is it's a question of scale, which you mentioned, but it has been a question so far of price and costs. You have to look at the people. So somebody said that the energy infrastructure is the more complex ever human endeavor, and if you calculate the value of the energy complex is extremely high. And therefore it has been built over 150 years. Our current energy system has been built over 150 years. So you have on one side enormous sunken costs, which are being amortized today, and they are cash cows. So you have a negative business incentive to change a cash cow. Point number one. Point number two, renewable energy technologies, up to very recently, about 5 or 6 years ago, they were relatively expensive when compared to the incumbent technologies. Now it's becoming different, although on a project on a single by single basis is true, but on a systemic basis is not that easily comparable. And this is one of sources of study that we're doing, because it is true that solar and wind by itself are getting cheaper than fossil fuels, but on a project-by-project basis, on a system basis, is very different because they are intermittent, because you need energy storage, because you need changes in the grid, etc., etc. And so that's a second question, an economical issue. So you have on one side technologies that have been very expensive till very recently, on relatively speaking, and almost sunken costs, which are cash cows. And I think the third comparison is if you take a look at the sectors where you had major breakthrough, sorry. For example, telecoms, right? Telecoms, you have very few companies today which run mobile phones, which are actually run as well fixed lines. Very little. People who came out with mobile phones were, disruptors, and they created a totally different system, a new service that did not exist before. Today, we are substituting electricity produced with fossil fuels with electricity produced with renewable energy, but it's still electricity. You still need the existing grid to bring that electricity around. So really, what you have been having windmills existed in the Middle Ages. Solar, we've been using solar, although not with solar panels, but it's been used, the energy coming from the sun has been used, and is used to grow crops, for example. Biomass has been existing since the man discovered fire. So all of these technologies have been around for decades, centuries, millennia, but they were not, at scale, and they've been using, actually, biomass has been for us, before fossil fuel, has been the main source of energy for millions of years or millennia. So we're not talking about a breakthrough. We're talking about incumbent people who make a lot of money with the existing system and not pay the prices of the negative consequences of that. And we're asking them to come up with a solution which has to be, providing the same services, but for environmental reasons. Mobile phones are much better than a fixed line. You can phone from everywhere. You don't need to go, as we were, when I was a kid, that you had to find a public phone and have the money and to pay. You can pay from everywhere. So they're offering a much better service. You talk about autonomous cars. Autonomous cars is a breakthrough. If and when we get there, is a breakthrough over cars. It will not be just from transport from A to B, but it will become maybe an amusement, or maybe an entertaining system that brings you as well A to B. As a secondary point. And that is a totally different value proposition for those technologies. Renewable energy is providing electricity, when transformed, or heating, or whatever, which is the same thing that fossil fuels are doing. So as long as we don't price the negative externalities, there's no real big difference between the two, because they are both providing energy services. The same thing.
Thank you very much, Dario. That gives me the chance for so many follow-up questions. Now the question is only with which one to start. Let's start with the cash cow.
Okay.
With the cash cow, that leads us to the situation of why should I change if it's comfortable? And that is with change in any point in life, but also with why should I change a well-functioning cash cow in terms of company budget, personal budget, country budget. And there's the question, how long will that cow survive, the age of the cow, because even actual cows stop giving milk at some point. So how do we encourage and stimulate this transformative innovation given the current challenges to help and take the fear away and show up pathways on how the revenue generated right now can help us building a cash pot that allows us to timely enough establish a new way forward that allows us to create a new cow from that existing cow, rather than waiting for the fossil fuels to run out, because the oil wells, for instance, are not endless, other technologies. So how could we stimulate or kickstart?
You have to admit that we've been calling peak oil and peak gas for many times, and we haven't seen that happening yet. And I still believe there are plenty of oil and plenty of gas available out there. So to answer your question, Stefan, I think, one of the biggest issues, I say this is the issue, what do you do with stranded assets, right? Which is, if abandoning fossil fuel means that you will have a lot of stranded assets. And what we have not been able to come up with is a solution for those stranded assets to create the economic incentive for people to not consider them as stranded assets, but and embrace the new technologies. And that's what you see today. The old fossil fuel companies that 2-3 years ago they started calling themselves energy companies. Now they're going back to investing into fossil fuels, etc., diminishing their cost because, of course, they have a stranded asset. They have the balance sheets to protect. And we haven't come up with a solution. There is a big change, but it will take time, which is the fact that solar and wind on a per megawatt basis, on a project basis, they have come down. Costs have come down so much. And this is thanks to the massive industrialization that took place in China, which is 93% of solar panels come from China, and around 70% of wind equipment comes from China. And that's because they massively industrialized, they brought down costs to a level where those technologies become competitive. So in places where you don't have access to energy, for example, for Africa, that it makes a lot of sense. Because you still have the issue around how you become totally renewable, right? Because you have the intermittency issue, you have storage costs. Storage costs have not come down in such a way as to make the whole system much more competitive than the existing system. You have individual pieces of the system which became competitive, which is going towards your concept of systemic transformation, but not the whole system. The whole system, transmission lines are still very expensive. Storage technologies are coming down, but not as fast as we would like, and not as fast as power generation technologies have come down. And therefore, that is what is making your system not competitive towards the old system. And that is what is creating the slowness in taking up the new, in transforming into the new system.
So there are certain points of opportunity for change, either enforced because of disasters of any sort, where the existing or the old infrastructure doesn't exist anymore or doesn't exist yet. And there, for instance, we see in parts of the region quite innovative and thoughtful approaches where they use decommissioned power generation sites, i.e. decommissioned coal-fired power plants, and use the existing power grid infrastructure to use that facility to feed in renewables there or to build up electrolyzers there because the grid capacity already exists. So how can we, or what can we do that these functioning small localized solutions can be made accessible, made be known to the decision makers in other parts of the region, and how can we scale those up? What could we do in terms of support programs, policies, or procedures to support that from your viewpoint?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things. One of if you look at emerging markets, one is the availability of finance, and the pricing, the conditions of that finance, of the financing conditions, because that is one is the question of you have a lot of money out there, but the pricing or conditions for that money are not such that is widely available for all of these projects, particularly when you're talking about this emerging, and then when you're looking at scaling up, when you need substantial amount of money. Renewable energy are very capital intensive upfront, as opposed to fossil fuels. On a per megawatt basis, they cost more than fossil fuel, but operating expenses are very minimal because they use mostly natural resources, which are free. And therefore, what you have is an important upfront cost for that. And that is what is lacking in when it comes to the transformation, when it comes to providing access to people who don't have access to energy, is that upfront cost. So how do you diminish that upfront cost? That's one. The second one is as well in many places is the lack of skills, lack of people with skills, that are able to build those plants. If you think that to substitute one gas power plants, they can go from a small, you have compact engines which are below 1 megawatt, but they can go up to 500, 800, even a 1 gigawatt. But that is very compact. And 1 gigawatt of solar takes an enormous surface. 1 gigawatt of wind takes an enormous as well amount of size, and you need a lot of equipment to produce that amount. Bearing in mind, one Sunday that 1 gigawatt of gas can produce almost 24/7. 1 gigawatt of wind, if you want 1 gigawatt of usable electricity, then you have to install a lot more than 1 gigawatt because the energy conversion is much lower. And so you need skills, you need people for that. And we come to a very important point, the critical raw minerals needed. These technologies use a lot of steel, a lot of cement, but a lot of critical minerals, which were not as needed and they're not used in the fossil fuels. So things, let aside copper, which is always used, has been used forever, but things like rare earths, things like cobalt, etc., that go into into wind farms, into the solar panels, which are extremely necessary. And to mine those minerals in such a quantities that are necessary for the scale up that Stefan was mentioning, it's a massive endeavor because we don't have the mines to do that. And developing a mine takes 10 years. So you don't have, even if you wanted to, today, we cannot produce the equipment at that level for power generation, for renewable energy at that level that is necessary for that power transformation. The second point is the bottleneck, the biggest bottleneck that people are understood finally, and Stefan, you know this very well, is the transmission. How do you evacuate? The need for, because you're talking about decentralized systems. We're moving from a place where you have extraction of fossil fuels, combustion of those fossil fuels, a production of electricity, and distribution towards end users. A very linear model and very centralized model to a model which is decentralized with several points, exchanging between demand and supply, users and consumers, many different technologies participating in the mix because we cannot rely on one single technology, and decentralized, so a hub and spoke type of a much more complex system than a linear model, and that needs to be circular because we can't continue as well mining, digging the same minerals forever, etc. The only advantage is that we don't need to bring any more burn fossil fuels, so the digging will stop one day. But that is the challenge. You're moving completely from a linear model, centralized model, to a decentralized circular model.
And that brings us very much to something that actually brought us together with ETIN, which was a bi-monthly we had with the group of experts in energy efficiency and the ETIN team. And that was on circularity by design and systemic efficiency, bringing together exactly those points that you mentioned, because in the long run, Earth's resources are finite and we cannot set on infinite growth, which means when we have the pressure to transform, to innovate and master disruption, we also need to think of models that allow us to consider, wait a moment, if there's resource scarcity, if there's resource resiliency needed, if we have the same thing with energy and we can't grow infinitively, wouldn't we need to think of circularity by design, i.e. highlighting to the product designers in the factories, not in the buildings or in the automotive sector or so, but to those designers that design products, to design it in a resource and circularity conscious manner so that the design allows at the end of lifetime to disassemble and use it again. And as a business model side, also to device business model that work in a everything as a service approach, where you don't sell and the incentive is to sell more, but to only sell when it doesn't work and get the kickback.
Right.
So those, I think, in the long run are prerequisites. Yet, however, we have noticed that we have just crossed so many silos within the Sustainable Energy Division. We have 6 groups of experts with colleagues from the Competitiveness and Trade Division. We have 2 different topics. Then with e-mobility, we have heard, we have another task force on that is meeting tomorrow on location efficiency, because things have to be at the right location. It's all a matter of systems. So how can how has tearing down those thematic silos about 2 years ago helped us to advance in our chances to create a resilient energy system?
I think. Sorry, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that question, because I'm so keen to bring in this slightly broader perspective. So on the one hand, many of these issues have not really stopped us from innovating in many other areas. If you look at the Dow Jones Index, actually 90% of the companies that used to be there 30 years ago are not there, and energy companies, I guess, are exactly among the ones that are still there. So it's actually an exception. And
fossil fuel companies.
Yeah. And these fossil fuel companies are already writing off assets, and it will take time before there is something that can really replace them. And then, well, we shouldn't be morally concerned about them. They have lots of money and windfall profits. They can invest it somewhere else. That should be a constraint that should be overcome. Carbon tax, yes, all economists would advocate for that, especially if it can be a simple way to replace all kinds of other de facto taxes and subsidies that are there right now, which can be confusing and counterproductive. But I'm also wondering that we've actually had a pretty high carbon tax corresponding to, I think, 100 social cost of carbon of about 100 in real terms on petrol in Europe. Now, so there were clear commercial incentives. Now, we've seen enormous progress in energy efficiency, but we also have many more cars and bigger cars, and people have become richer. So emissions are higher from that, but not much more. Not really any breakthroughs. Even though electric vehicles have actually been tested about a dozen times in history, but none of this has really taken off. And then the third issue is that it seems like everything is there. Finance is already there. You have venture capitalists. The alarm and urgency is more or less universally accepted. The track record of not even being able to lower emissions is there after several decades, and it's hard to dispute that case. It's also hard for me to see how the basic problems with intermittency, land use that you could attribute to wind and solar in particular, but also biomass, were ones that we thought would magically be resolved. And not even that. We seem to not even have hedged our bets. We seem to have put everything into relatively uncertain baskets and not tried out all other kinds of ideas. And yet, we already see several ideas. I read there's 1,000 different ways of harnessing nuclear, many of which would not even have the fissile density to make the problems that we're afraid of even physically possible. Geothermal and enhanced geothermal is, I don't want to downplay it, but it's basically a matter of being able to drill well deep into the ground, which seems like something that from an engineering perspective is much less of a feat than what we pulled up before. There's already biofuels, talk about algae, and there the challenge is basically how do we make it so scalable so that we can create hydrocarbons at scale. Some are very enthusiastic about wave energy. And of course, there's a silver bullet of fusion that ChatGPT has told me is more likely than not until the end of the decade. and they tend to be normally very cautious about this. And then, in addition to that, when you look at the history of innovation, no one predicted 10 years before we had Höchst-Haber process and was able to synthesize ammonia and then created an ammonia revolution, an agricultural evolution, or actually one of 5. No one would possibly think about that. No one would possibly think, I think 30 years ago, that telephone calls would be able to be made over video, almost universally available to even the poorest of this world, and be of high quality, and change that completely from a world where telephone bills could run. You were worried about every minute that you even talked to someone, and most people in the world could not even have access to a telephone at all. So the potential of human ingenuity is enormous. So my question is actually, in a world where we're not facing an end of fossil fuels, but something that many see as at least as alarming as facing the end of energy, why are we seeing so little of this, and why have we seen so little over the past 5 decades?
Look at the curve of innovation uptake. If you're an innovation student, you should know, you have seen how long it took for the car to take off, how long it took for the radio to take off, the TV, electricity, etc. And it takes, and the reason the speed of uptake of those technologies is an equation which depends on the availability of those technologies, their price, let's say, and their value proposition. As I said again, I want you understand the value proposition from not from us, which we are very sensitive to the environmental issues, but for somebody who is normally normal person. So you mentioned many new technologies outside of the energy sector, and what we proposed was a value proposition that was much better than the alternative, or much better than the incumbent. This is not true in the renewable energy. Renewable energy are producing the same product that a fossil fuel. Whether it's heating, whether it's electricity, there is no difference to the end consumer. You at home, you don't know what electricity mix you're using, or what is your heating. If you don't ask what the heating is coming from. You know, if you're using a mobile phone, you know there is a difference. You're getting a different service from a telephone line, from a fixed line. If you use a radio, you're getting a different system from reading the newspaper. It's a totally different. They created new markets, internet and all of these technologies. They created new markets. They created new needs. And they answered to those new needs. Eventually, some of them as well. Or they were so much better. The car was so much better than the horses that everybody was so easy to understand that it was much better. That is not the case with this energy system. It's because we don't see the negative externalities of this energy system. We don't see that with the fossil fuels, we only use 30% of the power. The energy conversion is 30%, is 1/3, and the rest gets to waste. We don't see the externalities. You mentioned the carbon tax, but you forgot to say as well how much subsidies we're giving out to consumers to keep those energy prices low, to keep those fossil fuels, low. This is what happened during COVID. It happened before, and it happens. It's only. I don't think. Don't quote me on this one, but I don't think that subsidies for renewable energies have overcame subsidies to fossil fuels yet. It might have happened on one or two occasions, but overall does not happen. So yes, in certain regions you have carbon taxes, but they are compensated by fossil fuel subsidies. So to me, the reason is you don't have today a technology solution in the energy space that it provides you with a value proposition that is so much better than the fossil fuels to be the aha moment. We might get there, because you mentioned some of the technologies which today in our work we say the solution is a diversity, a mix of energy sources, because you have as well the uncertainty around climate change. Think, for example, wind. When you install a wind farm, your wind it is installed on the basis of wind measurements taken over the last 10 years or 2 years or whatever is the campaign that you have. Going forward, you don't know whether the wind will blow in that direction with that intensity as it did in the past because of the changes in climate. So what are the energies, all the technologies that you mentioned before, those you can make sure that they will be there and they are available? Well, it's geothermal you mentioned, but not every country in the world has
enhanced geothermal.
Enhanced, yeah, that's exactly. They're discussing about enhanced geothermal, but still, for certain industrial processes that they need super high temperature, that is not a solution. I mean, electrification of industrial processes is okay till 200 degrees. Above 200 degrees, it doesn't work. That's why we use fossil fuels, because you need to get to certain temperature. Geothermal is not a solution for that. You mentioned another one, solar. Solar, if you think in terms of energy, the energy that we received every day from the sun is a multiple of our energy uses. But how you harness that energy? With the current technology, certainly solar panel, no, we get into 24, 25% energy conversion, and everybody's excited about that. We will need to, go towards 100% or 60, 70% of conversion of solar power into energy for us to be that breakthrough that you mentioned, to make it so incredible. But then the sun doesn't shine at night. And so there is always, they say that there comes up, the fusion, that is always the promised technology for the next 50 years. Every 50 years we say, oh, fusion, nuclear fusion is the next technology, etc. That is, if you want to call a potential technology that could substitute easily fossil fuels, because in terms of service and abundance of that energy, it probably that one. That's the only one. But that's what is the value proposition of these new technologies that can substitute, besides leaving aside, if don't think about the environment for 1 second. Think about the consumer experience, think about the industrial experience, think about the company experience. What do they get? It is true that today we have this issue, which has become more important, is energy security, which is a totally different ball game than energy sustainability. Because now, you mentioned before, you asked me, why these tech companies are getting into the energy, etc. They're not doing that for sustainability purposes. They're doing that because for them, energy security is so vital. The cost of that electricity, and this is the value proposition for them, having secure energy for them is worth immense amount of money, because a glitch in their electricity could have consequential issues. For you and me, energy security is important because you want to switch on the grid and then have electricity, but not as much as they are. And so they are investing massively into their own, integrating themselves into their own electricity producers. So the value proposition for them of energy is clear, because for them there is energy security, not energy sustainability.
And also,
I'm sorry to say that. It's horrible to say that, but we're talking about how the world is behaving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, go ahead.
And aside these points that you mentioned, we have the energy security ingredient, which has increased a lot as a part of the equation. But at the same time, we also have the cost part of the equation. So not only because of emission charges, but if we, for example, looked to a substitution from gas to hydrogen, there's the question, how reliably will I get it? Will I get enough? And at what price?
And what cost?
Right. And what is the comparative cost of change from gas to hydrogen or from gas to electrification? And because of time, I just refer to you another bi-monthly we had in December, where we had exactly that. One company focusing on zinc, said, well, we have a different ingredient mix at each of our sites because what's there and what we need is totally different at each site. So there's not a single answer. And you mentioned the affordability ingredient. It's super important, and that links very much to a justness of the transition. But the affordability element is this conundrum of the stimulants, meaning the fossil fuel subsidies, so that there's no unrest. On the other hand side, that slows down the change. But if we have emission charges, we have revenue. And at the same time, cost of energy will be higher for consumers. So how do we feed some money back to enable them to do the change? So solving that equation will be super tricky. But overall, the justness question is, we want people to move from where we are to a certain outcome. And people are at different locations. We say you need to get here, but we often are not good enough yet in showing how they can get there from wherever they are, and what are the solutions or the help mechanisms in that mix. And there, I think we are pleasured and really grateful for having thousands of experts that support our various groups of experts, task forces, etc., bringing in so much wisdom pro bono to facilitate this process and to help decision makers, be it private sector, government sector, and so on, to have the necessary ingredients to take wise decisions, impactful decisions. But how can we funnel that process so that this wisdom creates an impact? And how can we maintain that process given the financial situation in the UN system?
That is a question for me. Oh, for the controller of the UN. I think you raise a very important point. It's it's very hard. I mean, how can we have impact at the level of the policymakers, basically, with the work that is going on? And this is very true across a number of not just us, but IPCC and everybody. Basically, how can you have more science-based policymaking? I think that's what you're trying. What is your question? The leaving aside the UN financial situation, but how can you have more science-based policymaking? And I think here is one is the scientists need to become or participate more in the policy, become more socially engaged. I think there is huge debate in the scientific community now of following as well the issues we had with COVID, etc. What is the role of a scientist in society? Because which is fundamentally that. What is the role of scientists in society? Then you have all the repercussions that how can we get into that? And I think and some of and what we need to do is to get more people, more scientists involved into policy making. And one point, and the second point is I think policymakers are overwhelmed with information, and different opinions, different theories, different estimates, a lot of fake news, a lot of biased knowledge, because it's biased for business reasons or political reasons, etc. And I think already helping policymakers make sense of the chaos and the confusion which is out there, I think it will be useful. The issue, so the scientist method is let's analyze, test it, and if we fail, we go back and restart. In policy making, you can't really do that because you're playing with people's lives. You can't really, let's test it. Oh, sorry, it failed. I come back. The same thing, for example, a lot of people say, if you fail an app or an app doesn't work, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's, but if your airplane fails, that is a big deal. If you have blackouts, that is a big deal. it has consequences which are very different. Therefore, applying the same methodology, applying the same, you mentioned some of the processes and techniques that they used particularly in the communication business, when you go out with not unfinished product to test them, but you can do that in the energy sector. You can't go out with something which, let's test it. It works 3/4 of the time and 1/4 doesn't work. That doesn't work on an airplane either. I think there are issues which are not directly compatible, so you can't do that. And I think the same thing, as scientists who they need to be involved into policymaking, they need to understand that it is great to have theories, and it's great to be not sure about the theories and test them, etc. But when you go to policymaking, the game is different. The rules are different. So what we can try to do is be the bridge between science and policymakers, and clarify for policymakers what the different scientific perspectives are there. If you read I don't know if you read the IPCC, but the IPCC is all about probability and statistics and a number of, where possible goes. If you need to take a decision now, that's not a probabilistic approach. You need to take a decision now, which brings consequences one way or the other. And so I think that is a fundamental role that we can play there.
And thank you for using that word. And now approaching the last question before we open up to the next part. And that is taking decisions. Why are we taking decisions? Is it a lack of solutions? Is it a lack of money? Sometimes it is, but in general, it's more a lack of daring to take a decision. And that often is connected with unknown unknowns and perceived risks that might be much higher than the actual risks. But we see them as a perceived high risk because we have never done that before. And also with changing the status quo, the way how I'm doing things, I don't want to lose out. So I need to be sure enough that if I change, I must not lose. And that explains a lot of the hesitance in change, or sometimes blockades. And therefore, the affordability and the not losing out element is quite an important one. And there we have a bi-monthly on the 3rd of April, where we discussed that in the notion of triggering decisions to decarbonize the building sector, so the supply chain and buildings themselves, so the affordability element. And you also mentioned we cannot just try and fail. We see that we have a rapidly changing climate and fast progress in technical developments, particularly in the sectors you mentioned, energy, clean tech, AI. And those are really setting pressure or challenge the traditional decision-making models and government practices. And how can we take a little grain of that failure culture into policy areas where lives aren't threatened, i.e. defining outcomes rather than processes, as we did at the ETIN workshop, or allowing different areas where we can test or look at local solutions that work to allow them to grow by scale. Because essentially, do you know what FAIL stands for? First attempt in learning.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think what a policymaker would need to look at is how can I draft a flexible policy, a policy that is adaptable to changing conditions. Most of the times when we draft policies, they are very circumscribed, very detailed, and very prescriptive, and they're drafted on the basis of the current environment. That environment changes, those policies you don't know what the consequences are. So I think there is an effort that needs to be done in terms of policymaking, in terms of how we govern our societies and our government, our societies, in terms of introducing those elements of flexibility. I think it's not a question of introducing a grain of failure or how do you say, ability to withstand failure. That comes, in the energy sector, for example, the solution to that is redundancy. You know, if you're sure that one piece of your system will fail, then you need to have redundancy in that system, but embedded into your system, so that what that piece fails, you have the substitution already there. But redundancy costs. You know, you need to maintain it, you need to keep it, or only use it when a piece of your system fails. But when it comes to processes, it's not about capacity, redundant capacity, which cost is about how do you make that process more flexible. And we have very inflexible processes, let alone the UN. But let's not speak about the UN. But even at government level, we have very inflexible processes. And that's some of the things that we're looking when we talk about resilient energy systems. Is what we look at is we look at infrastructure, but we look at processes, resilient processes, which are systems, which combined create a system. Processes and infrastructure creates a system, and they look at the three dimensions that we mentioned before: sustainability, security, and affordability, and the trade-offs that you have to do. So I think that is an effort that, you know, and there are ways of making policy more flexible. You know, you have, like, insurance is becoming more flexible. No? You have famous, you know, paradigms in insurance that go, same thing, you know, there are systems you can introduce flexibility into policy making, which will create the opportunities for introducing new technologies and you know, facing uncertainty going forward.
Super important, particularly in these fastly changing times when
Exactly.
we cannot afford waiting 10 years until a new technology can enter the market. We need to
Correct.
get better here, and therefore this constellation that we're meeting at and collaborating in is the perfect soil to foster that. And with that, back to you, Emanuela. And
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think we can manage one or two questions from the floor, because we have one hand up here from Anastasia. Great to see you online. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. And it's actually both encouraging, motivating, and also eye-opening and to certain topics. I'm not from the energy sector, but I am from science, and I have some perhaps common questions, because we face some topics that are also interesting to mention from our side. And I just wanted to maybe elaborate a little bit more on how we do policy analysis and what problems we are facing, because I think once we go from both directions into one point, we will reach that point a lot faster than if we go in different directions. And I wanted to mention that, of course, there is basic science, which we all understand lives on a different planet and might be helpful in 50 years if we're successful. But then we also talk about applied science, and applied science is actually right here and right now. And as a representative of applied science, I would actually mention that we are really worried about the speed of change and how to address that as much as we can, because I mean, with AI right now, it will be a lot easier for us because we can formulate the hypothesis a lot faster and everything. But with the pressure that we have about delivering high quality research that can actually impact the policy analysis in a certain way, which is positive way, we require a lot of time to actually design the research. And this is where we have our limitations. And I can certainly comment on not on all of the community, but at least on some of the community. And this is what I see in the network, that everyone is stressed about some changes that happen in legislation that we can only analyze after like 5 years, when we have enough time to actually observe the change which has been caused by the specific change in the regulations, for example. And this is something we cannot avoid taken into account, because we have to see the change that we can report. This is exactly what's happening. And perhaps there would be some suggestion on how we can get more involved in the activities of policymaking, because we are interested in that, and we do all what we can, as well as the policy colleagues do as much as they can in involving us. So what I can say, we are very, very open to this, and we really want to be as effective as possible. So that would would be my comment. Sorry that it took the whole 2 minutes, but thank you so much. It's not really a comment, but more like an invitation to have more discussions on how we can benefit each other.
Well, join our expert groups.
And ETIN.
Exactly. Thank you.
I will gladly
Thank you very
do.
much. Thank you very much, Anastasia. Maybe one more short question from anyone. I don't see any other raised hands, but if anyone would like to ask a question, now's your chance. If not, then, I mean, we would, yes, Ami, please go ahead. You're on mute, unfortunately. Could you please
Sorry,
yes,
sorry.
thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. I thought I'd comment also on it. So I would argue, so I come from complexity science, and I would argue that really, and I also teach transition at the university, and I would argue that in most cases we cannot really predict any of these transition paths. I mean, it's just when things interact, it's very hard to make any predictions for the future. And so there was a lot of talk about resilience. I was just curious if the resilience that we're talking about is really about trying to kind of respond to shocks to get back to, your current state, or whether you see resilience really about responding to, shocks to build on top and get to a new future. So, the anti-fragile from Taleb.
Yes.
And that really comes back to this point of stability. Would you actually agree that maybe the problem is that we overvalue stability sometimes?
No, thanks, Amy. You raise a very interesting point, about resilience and the anti-fragile systems and the value of stability. Certainly, human beings, I think, psychologically value stability. I think we're by nature against and against sudden changes or changes that we don't understand. So that is a psychological barrier there, I think. When it comes to our definition of resilient energy is for a system which is capable to absorb an external shock and bounce back to the previous situation, i.e. to deliver the energy services as it was. So it's not in line with the system which is anti-fragile, which means that it incorporates the shock and becomes better by learning from the shock. And the reason why is why we are working on that, and which you can consider it as a second best option when looking. We should be really looking at building anti-fragile system and not just simply resilient systems, is because the security issue. The issue with anti-fragile systems is that as you said, the uncertainty. I disagree with you that we cannot design. We cannot estimate uncertainty. I think we can design. We ought to, and we have to, for policymakers and for us to design paths to understand that uncertainty. And that is it. We ought to do that from a policymaking perspective, because otherwise we're paralyzed. Having said that, which means that security of energy is such an important point and such a fundamental issue in our societies, that its value is so big that you don't want to play with, or we're not ready to play with. Let's say we're not ready to play with it. And I don't need to give you examples about how energy security is important.
Can I give one example? So in the Netherlands, after the gas prices really skyrocketed after the invasion by Russia, companies here were able to reduce their energy use by 25%. And nobody expected that. It's just
that's right. But is that because it's energy efficient? They introduced energy efficiency, or because they destroyed energy consumption? Because what happened after Europe, and you can see in our industrial footprint today, a large chunk of the energy consumption decrease is because we destroyed consumption. We outsourced chemical industries, we shut down chemical plants, we shut down energy intensive industries. And that is energy, that is, I don't call it energy efficiency, I call it energy consumption destruction. And part of it is energy efficiency, is right. But how big of that 25% is energy efficiency? And how big is actually energy consumption destruction?
Yeah.
And I can very much agree to that, as it's my core topic, that unfortunately it indeed caused hardship to many manufacturers. And there we have carbon leakage issues. And they're now for good shutting down their plants because it's way too costly to keep them running. And therefore we need to find new ways, new normal. And as Dario mentioned, a system that is getting increasingly robust, and whilst doing so, taking on board all those additional ingredients like being future-proof, being lower carbon, being economic. So how can we grow and innovate that system whilst the heart is pumping, without destroying it, without killing the affordability for end users, for companies, so that they collapse, because then we have more unemployed, which means higher cost to the social pocket and the country budget, which has all sorts of repercussions. And we have a very complex riddle to solve, yet many smart minds that help us.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe one comment on that. So one of the main insights from complexity science is that there is this link that we don't always understand between instability and diversity and change. Right. But maybe that's some time for another topic. But really, sometimes I think if you look at some of the ecosystems that we've built as humans, we don't have enough variation. And as a result, we get locked in and stuck.
Yeah. Daring to change, getting out of the comfort zone.
It's fascinating. What you study, Ami, is fascinating. Complexity theory is fascinating. Especially when you come to energy systems, which are very complex.
Now I think we have a game approaching.
Thank you very much for this. We'll leave it at that, and hopefully everyone is inspired to continue the discussion and the thoughts on this. While we live in unstable times, we do have one stable element of our Innovation Circle episode. That is the game segment towards the end. We'd like to get to know Dario a little bit better. So I'd ask my colleague Jacob to show the slide that we have prepared. Namely, we have prepared 3 statements that Dario shared with us. One of these statements is true, and we would like to invite all to vote on which statement you believe is true. So I've shared a poll now in the chat. Please feel free to vote. And then we look to Dario to release us from the suspense and tell us which is true. Okay. So
what is the verdict?
Right now, people are still voting, but it seems like number 2 is, yeah.
Tough questions.
Yeah.
I might note that there is not always ice on the Lake of Geneva.
No, I know. It's called ice swimming because it's
ice cold.
That's the name.
It's that cold.
Okay.
It's very close though, winter time.
Some people think it's also 3, but it seems we have the majority thinking that statement number 2 is true. Extreme finance is an expression that's...
No, that's false.
Which one is true, Dario?
Number
please?
3.
Number 3.
That's right.
No way.
I did.
I can see it.
When I was a student, to make some money.
Excellent. You have to share the names.
I registered myself up in the union, in the actors union. But I won't tell you what was my nickname or my scene name or whatever they call it. That's for another time. You have to invite me again to speak, and I will tell you what was my scene name. When you have to register yourself because of rights, no, because you get paid, rights from the movies that you are in. they ask you, what is your nickname? And that's for another time. I will tell you what was my nickname.
Well, now we definitely have to organize a follow-up conversation because now I really want
So
to
that's
know.
the one that is true. The other two are not completely false, but they are false.
Uh-huh.
They're more false than true. You know, but coming back to the issue about complexity, you know, nothing is really true and nothing is really false.
Everything is relative. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Dario. That's great to hear. So with that, we will end today's session. Thank you very much, Stefan, for moderating today. Thank you very much, Dario, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you, of course, to our dedicated ETIN members for joining. We are organizing the next episode on the 19th of March, where we have invited the authors of the Circular Economy Outlook for the Nordics to come and speak about the insights and findings of their recent publications. So we will be sending out the invitations for that shortly, and we really hope that you will be able to join us again. So Anders, would you like to say a few closing remarks before we close?
Yes, I want to thank everyone and Dario and Stefan for the discussion. I have so many questions that I want to follow up on, but I also think this might be an opportunity also to bring ETIN in, because specifically the political challenge of embracing risk, while at the same time we recognize that innovation is about trying 1,000 times, failing 1,000 times, and then finding something that works. And all kinds of commitment to the entrepreneurial state and flexible governance. What we see in ETIN is that this is really difficult in practice. This is really difficult within the incentives, the habits, the nature of the public sector, and I could almost every problem that people bring up here, you can relate to these core issues. So, what an angle that I would propose is actually, let's imagine what the ideal scenario would be. Let's think, for instance, of Google's Skunkworks, or what it's called. What I understand is they take enormous risks, but at a small scale. They try all kinds of crazy ideas to Oculus, for instance. You remember the failure of that. But they also stop at a certain stage and filter out the ones that don't have any promise. And very few of them work. And this, I think, is what we need in being able to replace fossil fuels. We might not. I think if history is any guide, 70 years down the line, when we have fixed it, or 50 years, so we hope as soon as possible, then the solutions that we have in place will mostly be not the ones that are on the radar screen right now. Back when we fretted about peak oil, we didn't even think about that we would become better at extracting, and even look at fracking, which was already, I think, a technology back in the 70s.
That's right.
So this sort of getting out this mindset, and also thinking about how do we do this politically? How do we take the idea of Google Works, at least in my vivid imagination, and scale it up and just use a fraction of the resources that we're actually spending on the climate transition to try to experiment with this idea and have as wild ideas as possible, as out there ideas as possible, more basic science that is deliberately targeted to create, to discover where the potential is, to have entrepreneurs go and try out specific ideas, support them, but also stop what's not working and learn from that and move on to the next one. If you try out 1,000 ideas with tiny likelihood, statistically, several of them
something will stick to the wall.
And at the same time, the losses of those many small ones will be by far outweighed by the huge gains of the working one.
Right.
Excellent. With that, please feel free to engage more in ETIN, where we continue these discussions. And again, thank you for joining, and see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.